Okay, webcast is on, so we're going to begin. We have folks, what do you call the electronic? Hi. And then here. All right, so today, I'm Brian Leahy. I'm the director of the Department of Pesticide Regulation. Today we're going to talk about endangered species and pesticides. Just as a side note, I was farming rice up in Butte County in 1980. Our neighbors, the Lundbergs, came over and told us that our wildlife-friendly rice was organic, and you get twice the price, so we became organic. But our concerns with pesticides always had to do with wildlife. From the person that taught me how to farm, my father-in-law, after the war, they first introduced a lot of the chemistry. He noticed the effects on wildlife and figured out how to avoid that. So, you know, this is very important, very dear and near to my heart. Today, well, first off, if we hear a funny noise up on the roof, that means we should leave. And so we'll go down the stairs and go over to the Cesar Chavez Park. If you need restrooms, you go out the door, go that way, and on the end there, you'll find them. Today is, we have Polo Moreno, who is going to talk about endangered species and pesticides. As you know, that's part of our mission, is the protection of human health, but the other half is the environment, which includes endangered species and as well as your dog and everything else. Polo's been here since 1989. You're an expert in avian biology, endangered species, conservation biology, and GIS, among others. And he shares his knowledge with the feds, the state, other departments, children. He's very active in a lot of great stuff. So anyways, we're here to, Polo, you want to come up and start your presentation?
Thank you. So when I was asked to talk about endangered species and pesticides, this is something that I've been doing for quite a while, and I do outreach statewide dealing with continuing education training for many of these organizations that train pesticide applicators, as well as state agencies that also have their on-site trainings, and the county ag commissioners throughout the state. So California has the not so enviable honor of having only less endangered species than Hawaii. We're second to Hawaii in the number of endangered species. What you're seeing in the back is a rough map, primarily the federally listed species. And so when we add state and federally listed species and other special status species, especially plants, you can get up there over 1,000 of them. So some of the species that we have in our state are more known by the public in general. So kid fox, California red-legged frog, Leesville's vireo. Others less known, but still out there and definitely worth protecting. So all from plants to mammals, insects, in all kinds of invertebrates, as well as birds, reptiles, etc. We got them all. Our program, our project, as we call it, the Endangered Species Project, started back in 1988 with a grant from US EPA based on a approach to Endangered Species Act consultation or endangered species protection, in this case for the pesticide part of it. Having a program that could be developed through 7A1 section of the Endangered Species Act, which allows for local plans like this by the states to look at ways to protect species without getting fixated only on the consultation process, which can be pretty lengthy. So we started developing these local plans back in 1989, 1990, looking at individual sites for a small sampling of endangered species that back then US EPA had provided us to look at and see the possibilities to address some of these concerns of pesticide use and these endangered species, mostly Central Valley, mostly some of the rodenticides, and back then I think we started with the Aleutian Canada goose back in the late 80s. So these local plans, we'd have these public meetings, bring in people from all walks of life and all different agencies, both federal and state. So we'd have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the now California Department of Fish and Wildlife, back then California Department of Fish and Game. Also a big element here was the California Agricultural Commissioners, depending on the local area as well, and local growers, local pesticide applicators, environmental advocacies, people that were interested in protecting the species. So we decided to open it up for all of them. The table was open for everyone, not just this one side of the issue, because with the other side not participating, you won't get too far. So from back in the early 90s, we started with public participation, as we call it nowadays. So many of the stakeholders that had been working with us since and in different occasions in the present too, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Department of Fish and Wildlife here in California, California Department of Food and Agriculture, the California Agricultural Commissioners Association, and again, these local advocacies, species experts too, different university professors that are interested in the preservation of different species. They bring in a lot of expertise on the knowledge of many of these species. And so all of this process that we've been implementing over the last, almost 30 years has been with that in mind, to present a local approach to a process that can take many years and offer an alternative while federal consultation is taking place with different pesticides or active ingredients in those consultations. In the meantime, we provide this program, which is more of an educational and outreach program to help growers make a decision as to what product they can use safely, if it's feasible, with a little extra work. So the label in many of the pesticides doesn't have that extra information for endangered species protection. This is where we have done the work, gone through all these different active ingredients we have in California. And during the registration process that California has here at DPR, as well as existing registrations that we have, we look at the products, we categorize them, and then look at the species, the locations of those species, where they are in general in our state, and the likelihood of those being exposed in that proximity to some of these application sites, and how we can maybe modify the method of application or simply the timing of the application in a year to control that exposure, or to attempt to control that exposure. And so during those developing years, we have developed these pesticide use limitations, are some of these local plans that we mentioned, and incorporated them all into the Endangered Species Project. Those use limitations basically are methods of application that might have been modified, sometimes restrictions, sometimes prohibitions in some cases. The products cannot really be used safely in the vicinity of the species. And then that is provided to the user depending on the location that they're looking at, that they're searching for, and the product they intend to use. These use limitations then are geared toward the lawful use of pesticides out there, while the growers or other ranchers might be doing their lawful business out there making these applications. So that this allows for that. Our program is not an enforceable program. Again, it's more of an educational program, but it does provide that additional measure of analysis to the setting where the application might be taking place, the product that is going to be used or intended to be used, and the species that might be in the vicinity of those. Once you give them that information and assist them also into knowing what that double-crested nuthatch or whatever you have out there, or the San Joaquin kit fox looks like, they make a better connection to the actual issue there. They say, oh, I've seen them out there. Sure, yeah, I know what you're talking about. You know, you're going to use it there, do this. And they agree with it. We looked from the beginning, we tried to develop something that would make it feasible, that people could live with. We had meetings, endless meetings in different counties back in the 90s, looking at maps with a lot of circles and dots and points and say, oh, you know, here, no, it's not there, it's this and that. And we wanted to talk to the guy in the middle of the red circle there, the guy that, according to the map, was in the thick of it, and say, can you live with this information, these methods of application, these modifications to the current application for that product? When that worked out, when they realized where it can be done and when it cannot be done, but you give them an alternative. If you're not going to use that, try this one and apply it in this mode, in this form. And we had pretty much, you know, a great success with them. They agreed on this. From the get-go, we've been working with the commissioners in different counties with this, and they saw the value of that. And so we offer this to California applicators as guidance, if you want, on how you can do this, how you use these pesticides without risking having problems of a but I wouldn't call it a misapplication, but more of an application that did not have any consideration on these species. So it allows them to have a better understanding of what they have out there and how they can use the product more safely. It might take a little extra work, but they can still do it. The alternative basically would be a challenged registration, where eventually the product might be taken out of a registration. So they understood that part too. And it's okay, we'll work with you. That's where this is the setup of what we have. Our project focuses now in the following activities. We develop, when needed, some of these use limitations. If new species listings come up or new habitat is found and there's an issue with current pesticide use, we again call in public meetings and we sit down and try to work with all the parties involved in there. We also, the meat of the program right now is looking at the information that is generated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is California Department of Fish and Wildlife, through the Natural Diversity Database, and generate the information on the species locations. We work with the information they provide us, and we filter it, if you want, down to the 1 square mile precision for the species locations. That's only to help us raise a flag when their applications might be taking place in the vicinity of the habitat. You're seldom going to find the actual species in front of you waiting for you to take a picture or something. So you're more likely to see the habitat where they are found. And that's what we're using for reference in our section scale resolution. So developing that information, technological advances have helped greatly to make this possible now twice, sometimes 3 times a year, to update our database known as PRESCRIBE. And also, so we do the maintenance of PRESCRIBE. If we find new images to help show applicators what these species look like, which we now have over 1,400 images for species that we have in California, including federal and state, and try to make those available there so they can look them up on the website. And also we do a lot of public education and outreach, which is what I do a lot, travel different parts of the state and present the information to them. And all that information is put also up on our website, made available through the Ag Commissioner's offices in hard copy. We have field identification cards that usually summarize the information on the PowerPoints that we have. and show lots of pictures and graphics illustrating what these species look like or their habitat looks like. And that helps the applicators out there use them. They're similar to baseball trading cards, about that size, 4x5 cards. And we also have all of those materials translated to Spanish also. We've been working on that for quite a while. And we've made them available also on our website. Last year, we did a major update to our website where it posted all the cards, both in English and Spanish, on the website as well. So people can just print them out, or if they see the card and see the value of having those in their operation, they can contact us and we'll be glad to mail them free of charge. So all of those materials, again, are made available both through mailing to us or contacting the commissioners, PAPA, CAPCA, and other organizations that see the value on this. So how do we locate these endangered species in our state? What do we do there? Well, we take what you see out there might be a landscape in general, you know, the earth. We're going to make it at this scale just for showing what we do. You might see this landscape out there. We see this. This is the type of information we get from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife, California, where we have all these shape files, as they call, all these little dots and circles and lines following the path of a riparian corridor, a creek, a stream, sometimes these extensive habitat areas designated for species like the desert tortoise and others. They might be very expansive. Others are less precise compared to the smaller circles, but they basically represent a sighting of that particular species by a person possibly doing a survey, and they could not tie it into any specific location on the ground or on the riparian habitat. They might have been just, if it was a bird, it might have been just soaring around, but they did identify the species. So it's such types of reports you see also there for reference. We do take all the information and then select only those active occurrences, those that are, I think they're listed as extant. Not extinct, extant, existing locations. And that is then put in our database. We select that data, those shape files you see back there, we select them and use this cookie cutter if you want. We use these townships and part of our California public land use survey system to create a reference of where they are. This is that filtering to the 1 square mile resolution of these species databases. So in California, as in many other states, our land use is subdivided into these townships, and the townships by themselves, they are subdivided into 36 square miles. Some might not be exactly 36, some might not be exactly the same size because there's also these public land grants from a long time ago, but for the intents and purposes of our database and our analysis, we split it up all into 1 square mile sites, just to give us a sense as to where these species occur within that grid. Nowadays, we're spoiled and we love to have Google Maps and Google this and Google that and driving directions and street address matching. We'll get there. We're working on it right now. We have the Township range section grid. It works fine. We started with this because also this is how pesticide applicators make their pesticide use reports. They use the Township range section grid for their reference, and that's how they report what pesticide they use in the area where they live, or they make the applications, and that's how they're being reported. And we started working on the agricultural environment. Of course, as we moved our program more at the statewide level, we have many urban settings like Southern California, the Bay Area, many areas like Livermore and others that have this mixture of agricultural land as well as urban lands. And then you're dealing with also private applications by pest control companies like Clark Pest Control and others that are also coming up to some of these areas that have endangered species habitats. So we are trying to develop this also at a level where people can look up the information by hopefully street address or lat long, we'll see, as we develop this and make it accessible at every level. But even now, as you will see in a few minutes, with the mobile version of PRESCRIBE that I'll be talking about, people are able to locate these habitats where they are with using simply by using a mobile device, phone or a tablet that is GPS enhanced. So this is our grid system that we have for the information on the endangered species. We're looking at the habitat, basically, as I said before. So those little boxes you see, those little squares that are the sections within those townships. These little sections here are coded in such way that you have the township 1 north, range 4 east, section number 14 for that example, and that makes reference to that particular square. That little square, just for illustration purposes, might mean that. That little square next to other squares that are also a square mile, like here near Livermore. And we're looking at the California tiger salamander, the habitat being Arroyo Mocho Park. This is this here. This is the actual habitat. And these are the actual issues we have with California tiger salamander in the vicinity of Arroyo Mocho Park when they're moving and using ground squirrel burrows. So they use abandoned ground squirrel burrows, and somebody trying to get rid of the ground squirrels definitely needs to check, make sure that currently that is an active ground squirrel burrow and not somebody else's burrow. So that's the approach, so to identify that habitat, to make sure that what they're looking at is active ground squirrel habitat and not a other species that is using that same for shelter. A lot of the materials that we have developed in the form of PowerPoint presentations are made available through our website. We present them at different workshops statewide and make them available. They're intended for a basic description of what these species look like, what their habitat looks like. We try to put as much information and graphics there, make it easier to understand. We don't intend the user to become a PhD on biology, but we want them to know what these critters look like so that they can say, oh, okay, or what their habitat looks like. Help them with that part. Okay, as I mentioned before, we also have those that information condensed into these cards that we have and distribute all over the state, and again, made available also through the website to help them with that. So this is that is what our program or our project is been developed as a outreach and education program assisting applicators with choices as to what product they can use and how they should use it if they prefer that. As we move along the process of a consultation, as you will see on this next topic that I'm covering, if anything comes down the pipeline from US EPA, who is officially the agency that consults with the Fish and Water Service or National Marine Fisheries Service on the effects of pesticides, and on a particular active ingredient, they have found that it might affect species, then certain mitigation measures, any restrictions that come down the pipe, we can incorporate them into PRESCRIBE as well when people are looking for that information for a particular product. So now going into what pesticides and the Endangered Species Act have to do with each other, I'm going to try to give you a brief summary of what we're dealing with. If you look at this slide, there's a smattering of all kinds of terms, all kinds of acronyms and lingo that you go, okay, and that is. The way I look at this, In the case of pesticides, registering the pesticide, in this case for EPA or DPR, is equivalent, when it comes to the endangered species, to building a dam, or building a pipeline, or building a power line, or building a subdivision and taking out a lot of landscape, etc., that might be impacting, in this case, here's a Chinook salmon. So if you're going to do something that might affect this guy here, you need to consult. You need to find out what can be happening out there when you develop this project. In the case of EPA, this the registration of the pesticide. If you're going to register that product, what's happening to those species? If you think about it, most of these, many pesticides have been registered way before the Endangered Species Act was enacted, back in the early 70s. So it's not easy to just say, oh, well, then just go take everything out of the table and let's go back and take a look. So that is what the continuous consultation process that US EPA has, is looking at different products, the hardest ones to control sometimes, to see what to do with those products that are already registered or they're up for re-registration, and so they consult. The process then it involves several elements that make it a little more lengthy to develop this information, and it's usually looked at as one active ingredient or a group of maybe 4 or 5 active ingredients and a particular species or maybe a couple of species in a group. With the number of species that we have just looking at California, again, this is looking at the federal level. We have like 1,500 species at the federal level, federal listed species that need to be consulted upon. Think about the number of chemicals that we have. So the process takes a while. In the meantime, we have to present something to the applicators out here in California to work with. And that, again, even though it's not an enforceable program, is education for them to know what choices they can make that would be safer for these species that we have in California. So the process, once we put it in the right order, and this is a simplified graphic, mind you, starts with US EPA looking at a product in particular that is registered or intended for registration, and they do their own effects determinations on those products. They look at the product and see what can be impacting in there. If they find that that product, as they're looking at the different settings, the different species that might be addressed in this particular analysis, now, recently, since 2013, they added one step at that early stage for public comment. It's in the effects assessment, actually, but it's the same goal, looking at the product to see if it has any effects on the species or its habitat. So during that process, if there's any information that the public can provide, be it the actual individual people or agencies in other states, in other organizations, that's where the information can be put into this online, what do you call it, the information for the analysis of this product on the EPA website and the online docket. And so then it goes 2 ways. They ran the analysis and either they find that the product is not likely to adversely affect that species or its habitat, or if it's likely to adversely affect the species, then the analysis continues. At that point, they say there is need for consultation. So they submit that packet with their analysis to one of the 2 services, either if it's a species that is a fishery species, a commercial species, an aquatic species that we have primarily, that would be the Natural Marine Fisheries Service, or in the other case, it would be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, federal agencies. So they contact either one of these agencies, and they present the information and request their biological opinion. At that level, they the Fish and Wildlife Service or NMFS, National Marine Fisheries, will look at this and either find that there is no jeopardy, as they call it. No, there is no issue. We found out that it didn't happen, but that seldom will happen. Or if they find jeopardy, as they use this term, then they'll present what people should do according to their view for protection of that species from that pesticide. And those are called reasonable and prudent measures or reasonable and prudent alternatives. That information then is posted on a draft biological opinion for public comment again. The people look at this, at the information that is being posted, and again send their opinions, the information they might have, additional data that might help change sometimes some of these recommendations, looking at the local knowledge and people that might have been dealing with this issue and asking for their opinion. This is where they would put in their 2 cents there. Once that is done, then they generate their final biological opinion with final RPAs, original and prudent alternatives, and or final reasonable and prudent measures. From there, they hand this over to US EPA. And US EPA can either choose to implement that verbatim as produced there, or looking at their own files with their own expertise, decide they can implement it this way or change it and present it. In the end, what is developed from US EPA would be the implementation of those protective measures for that species if needed. And they would be contacting the registrants for their modifications, sometimes to the language on the label, and looking at the product, or the product is so difficult to control and that they just no see way out of it, it might be looking at cancellation for the registration. That's where they send this notice of intent. At that level, those measures or that language that would be reflecting this analysis would be added to the label, the particular product's label. And so that is the process that entails the protection of endangered species through the endangered species process known as consultation. Once you have those products that are registered, like we do have, now part of the information I was asked for was also what are the potential risks to some of these endangered species in the case of rodent control, for an example. Our program deals with all groups of pesticides. I want to highlight one is rodenticides, but we're dealing with everything: rodenticides, herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides at that level here in California. We started with rodenticides back in the early 90s, so we'll give you a sampling of that, of what we developed there. Looking at some of the potential risks we have out there and actual current issues we have out there, when people use baits to control some of these rodent pests, they got to do a very thorough job keeping the product in those bait stations, if it's a station delivered product, or if they're broadcasting, make sure they're broadcasting in the right areas without getting too far from where they're supposed to be doing this. And keeping the product, again, in good control, and always keeping those stations free from overspilling or overfilling them and the product just slipping out into the fields there. So as you can see in this slide, looking at one of these bait stations that have the inverted T configuration, we have an issue there when those are used in areas that support some of our endangered kangaroo rats and other non-target species, where these might be just open right into that habitat. Also, we're looking at things that happen sometimes when people don't want to do diligence work on the survey and collection of carcasses out there. And the products, the carcasses of some of these poisoned squirrels are left on the surface. Many of these many of these predators, like coyotes, mountain lions and others might be picking these up. And so we're looking at secondary poisoning there too. Things like misapplication of rodenticides that come in bait stations to be used only in the bait station. Some of these pellets, and people, just for good measure, take the leftover pellets instead of waiting until they need to use more and just scatter them around in the vicinity of of that bait station. Another big problem. Many of these have happened in some of the urban areas where people are buying these to control rats, and the product can be passed on to these wildlife species that have been adapting to these urban wildland interface in some parts of our state. So that is a serious concern dealing with that. For the protection of these non-target species, we have in place several use limitations that deal with both the design of these bait stations to prevent the spilling of the product, as well as modifications for some of the areas that are in the proximity to San Joaquin kit fox or some of the kangaroo rats, that provide instruction as to how to modify existing bait stations so that you can safely use the product without affecting the non-target species, whether it is by elevating these bait stations, the box-type bait station, on stilts. And we developed some of these cards also with that in mind to show people how to modify these and what types of measurements they need to take care of. Make sure that they use, for instance, stilts that are inset 2 inches, so there's still a lip around the entire platform, and et cetera, and where they should be using this type of device, for instance. And all that information is also posted on our website as well. Or if they're using some of the bait stations like that inverted T design, the modifications that were developed by UC Extension. At UC Davis, they developed both these elevated bait station platforms as well as these modified T-bait stations with a grant from CDFA back in the 90s, looking at these kangaroo rats as well as kit fox in different parts of the state, testing these in the field out in the Carrizo Plain, finding it very successful that these successfully kept the non-target species from getting into the bait, while the squirrels could climb in and out of these throughout their feedings on this. So this design was very successful on this type of approach. And again, the same instruction information is put in one of these cards. In this slide, you're looking at both front and back of that card. So it's more like a 4x5 card, both sides of it. Then we're looking at other risks on other types of rodenticides where species that use burrows for their shelter, the use of burrow fumigants can be an issue when they're being applied to the wrong burrow. Many species of burrow-dwelling, many burrow-dwelling species occupy some of these squirrel burrows when they're not used by the squirrels, and they rarely move into them. Salamanders, garter snakes, burrowing owls, desert tortoises, kit fox, they all use these. They might modify them and enlarge them sometimes if they need to. Usually this is friable soils, soft soils where they can modify these and move right in. So for that, we also developed some limitations or use limitations where people that are making these applications of burrow fumigants need to be familiar with what these active ground squirrel burrows look like and what these burrows, when they're occupied by somebody else, look like. So we develop materials also to help them navigate this. How do you know this is an active ground squirrel burrow versus somebody else's? So we'll look at things like sign and track. What things usually show on the vicinity of these burrows when they're actively being used by some of these pest species? What happens when somebody else is using it? What kind of things do you see around those burrows? What kind of debris you might find at the entrance? What kind of tracks you might have in the vicinity of that burrow? How do you tell the tracks of ground squirrel versus somebody else's. That type of information, again, is also been put together in the form of PowerPoints and the cards that we have for different species to help you identify some of these tracks in the vicinity of them. Things like pellets that some of these burrowing owls might leave by the entrance of the burrow as well, or whitewash sometimes help tell that somebody else is using those burrows. So that information, we put it together, as I said before. Another very important part of this is the process of carcass survey and disposal, making sure that when you have your baiting station set up, that you're checking them during those feedings that they're going on for the weeks that you have it on, making sure that you do these diligently, making sure they're collecting these carcasses and burying them or disposing of them, and not leave them out there for carnivores and other species that could be collecting them, picking them up. So that information, whether it's the rodenticides or the other groups of pesticides that we have, initially had been made available to growers and applicators through paper bulletins. But these paper bulletins were massive. There were 60 pages to a bulletin, kind of like the taxes, the forms, 1040s back in the 80s, I guess. And you say, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? Well, and that had been already simplified for them to use. So we developed, Rich Merovich, actually, one of the core of this program to develop a database to look for this type of information in a more efficient manner, and also being able to update it more efficiently, along with Catherine Bilheimer, another one of our coworkers there. And so they developed this online database for moving that information more efficiently and being able to upgrade it so much more faster than what we had when we were looking at one Adobe PageMaker or whatever design bulletin, 60 pages long, and then the information changed a year later. You go, oh my goodness, I need to change those tables and retype them and all that. So it was a major leap developing this online application. So those bulletins in 2005 were officially replaced by PRESCRIBE. And so PRESCRIBE is this mouthful of an acronym, is the Pesticide Regulation Endangered Species Custom Real-Time Internet Bulletin Engine. Hence PRESCRIBE. It describes what it does. Whenever you go online looking for airline tickets or movie tickets or driving directions, you're using somebody's engine or server. So this engine generates these bulletins on the internet, custom to the information you put in the real time, custom to the information you select, tells you what endangered species you have there, and the pesticide regulations that apply, hence PRESCRIBE. PRESCRIBE brings a lot of information together, both on the endangered species information, in this case from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Natural Diversity Database, that provides the majority of the information on endangered species locations, as well as the Natural Marine Fishery Service, where it comes for salmonids and other species, aquatic commercial species, and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that has also plenty of information available there. So bring it all together and do these updates to PRESCRIBE, sometimes 3 times a year, sometimes 2 times a year, depends, but that's a major contrast to what you would have with a paper document. The pesticides and toxicology data comes from US EPA federal consultations from the past, as well as the information that we have available, made available through Department of Fish and Wildlife Pesticide Investigations Unit. For many years have also assisted us with that, and also DPR's own files here as well. Information on the species comes from many different sources, species experts, university programs, that we have many of them in the Central Valley and other parts of the state, as well as literature that we also do consult quite often. So all of that and the use limitations that have been developed over the course of these years were developed, again, in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the US EPA, the county agricultural commissioners, all the people that work in the Department of Pesticide Investigation, the Department of Fish and Wildlife's Pesticide Investigations Unit. They were instrumental to this too, a lot of their expertise and analysis of what we had going on out there, and as well as, again, our own work here at DPR to combine it with them. So it's a collaborative effort, and whenever something is lacking or we find that some of the information might not be quite accurate, we put it back on the table to get together and look at what needs to be fixed. These use limitations that we have in place are not set in stone. If something better comes up, we'll be glad to plug it in there. So PRESCRIBE itself, to access that on our website, you can look at that address right there on the website. To navigate this or to do a query, I'm going to show you a sample of a query that you would be doing when you get to PRESCRIBE. Basically, the first thing you would do would be to select the county where you intend to make your application. For this example, I selected San Joaquin County. Once you have selected the county, then you see this listing of all those little boxes that I talked about earlier, the townships and the sections. So you select the township or townships that you might have in the area where you intend to make your application, and the section or sections where you're going to make the application. Once you have that, you might get if there are some of these habitats present in those areas you selected, it will show you on the next page what species you have in that section or sections. This is something at this point to clarify to people. Many people think that PRESCRIBE is a database to look for endangered species. That would be the most inefficient way to find out what you have out there, because this is a random process. You're looking for information related to the area that you want to make an application at. It's not, let me see what I have in my area. No, it combines both the information on the species and the pesticide you want to do. So in the end, there's two parts of that process that need to be brought together and tell you if there are some endangered species, what you have up there and what to do with the pesticide. So if you just want to go look for the species, it's going to take you forever. Don't use PRESCRIBE. There's better stuff than that. So in this process, as you're looking at the site where you intend to make an application, we do have that information at that square mile resolution to tell you what habitat of that species occurs within that mile. And if you see that habitat out there, that's where you shouldn't be using the product in the way you normally do. It follows the instructions that we have. So here you have a listing on this sample. I went and selected an area that I knew that has something, so you look at what types of instructions you would get. And so here we have a couple of rodent species that are endangered, and the riparian wood rat and riparian brush rabbit. Then we also have probably something in the vicinity of the San Joaquin River. Here's a steelhead as well, tricolored blackbird, and Swainson's hawk. That's another issue, Swainson's hawk, a raptor. They can also pick up some dead ground squirrel from the ground if you don't look for them and take them out. So make sure you take those carcasses out, bury them, incinerate them, whatever. Don't leave them out there. So as you will see, when you go back, it'll clear out this during the process, analyzing this. So you look at also these names of these species. You can click on any of them, and it'll show you a summary of that species information. What it looks like, got a picture of it, what the habitat looks like, what color it has, how big is it. That's a basic summary, the species details. So you can look for those. They're all in those links there. I think we have only maybe a few tens of the species if we count all the plants that we've added to our database that are missing out of like 1,300 that we have. So it's been a long process. Catherine Milheimer has been working years to complete that image collection. So, but that information is put together there. made available for you. So then, once you know you have an endangered species, or several of them in there, and you intend to use a pesticide, here's where you would go and put the information about the pesticide you intend to use. And in this case, you can either use the commercial name of the product or its EPA registration number. So here, this is where you link up to DPR's chemistry data base, and you can select the product, the specific formulation that you want under that commercial name. So there's many products, like in this example, Ramic, rodenticide, many different baits, many different formulations. Look up the one you want, select that one. In this case, we selected Ramic Oats, which kills ground squirrels, according to that name there. You can also see the EPA registration number on that. So you select the product. So right now, we know we have several species that can be impacted by our rodenticide. And we selected this rodenticide. What should we do with that rodenticide for protection of these species? The last step is this report that you get. This might be 2 pages long, depending on your computer and your printer's capabilities. It might print to a couple of pages, but that includes all the use limitations that that will be required for those species that can be affected. Like I said before, here we have 2 rodent species that might get impacted by that bait, as well as a raptor that can be picking up some of those carcasses if you don't bury them there. So if you look at the bottom of this page, you would see codes of those use limitations, code 1B for pertaining to the bait station design and use, things that you need to make sure are part of that bait station, reduce the opening to less than 3 inches or less, monitoring those stations, making sure that the bait is not being spilled and not collected, surveying for carcasses. Also, if those 2 species of rodents in the particular areas of Stanislaus and San Joaquin County have their own use limitation for protection of those 2 strict riparian species or obligate riparian species that keep themselves pretty much in the dense riparian vegetation, where you can actually groups like Bureau of Reclamation that have extensive levee systems around the valley can still use bait stations, like the inverted T-bait stations, so long as they cap them overnight, about 2 hours before sunset and 2 hours after sunrise, for these 2 riparian species, instead of the setback of 100 or 200 feet from a regular wood rat that might be wandering around different sides of that area if they're not this riparian wood rat, as they would, or the brush rabbit. This gives some flexibility to that so they can still use their baits even on the levee as long as they cap them overnight. So then one last part of this presentation is also to show you PRESCRIBE mobile. So we have PRESCRIBE online that I just showed you. And since 2014, we also launched PRESCRIBE mobile. It's not an app per se, it's a web server too, but you can log into it from your phone or your GPS-enhanced tablet and look up the information. And this is also a great advantage for the urban setting where people can actually bring their smartphone in the area where they're going to make an application, and they're in the vicinity of that particular square mile, and it'll tell you where you are without you having to know the township, range, section, grid, coordinates. You don't have to learn Latin or Sanskrit or whatever to do it. You can use your phone, and it'll find you and tell you what you have. So PRESCRIBE, as it was made available, allows you to use your location as you would be looking at in that particular application, and you'd select you and tell you in that moment where you are, in what county. In this example, I just put Sacramento, and it'll tell you where in those township and range and section coordinates you are. That's the first thing it tells you. As you move down, it also then asks you for the product you intend to use. Here's a little different. Instead of telling you first what species you have, it just asks you what product you want to use. In the end, it'll be the same result. But so you have then the product to select. In this case, I think I selected Sawyer, an herbicide, I think. And then it shows you all the registered products under Sawyer, and you can tap and slide around the screen to see which one it is, and get all the information, select the product or products, and then, as you see, these are parts of those phone screens that you pull up and down, but that's what you're looking at there in those two little JPEGs. You're looking at the phone screen with all the information related to that location with Sawyer and the protection measures that you need to follow for the protection of. At the bottom of that screen is the Chinook salmon, several they call it evolutionarily significant units or runs in some cases, as well as steelhead that you have there. Once you have that, you can also look up the information on that particular species that we had before by clicking on the species picture. And that pretty much brings it all together for you.